Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is a series of conversations, podcasts, videos where myself, Glenn Ford, a games designer and developer, talks to my good chum Mike Hutchinson, also a game designer and developer, about designing better miniatures games. And usually we freewheel quite wildly around the topic of designing better miniatures games in general, but today we're going to talk about something a little bit more specific about designing a better miniature game.
Yes, and very much about designing it better.
So a couple of days ago, myself and Mike had a physical meeting of within my gaming room, and we got to playing a bit of Pacific Command, Mike's upcoming game that will be out from Osprey at this point, I think sometime next year now.
What year are we in? Yeah, it'll be in 25 sometime. Yep.
Of epic fleet battles within the Second World War Pacific arena, I guess is the
Mhm.
right term. It's a game of so because you were very interested in the whole sort of the theater of operations. It's quite sort of pulled out, or it's not. It's not that it's pulled out. It's that the only scale at which like fleet maneuvers make sense is quite a pulled out sort of scale. And so it's played with poker chips rather than actual miniatures, because a lot of those engagements were also about the admirals outguessing at each other and outwitting each other. There's a lot of fog of war and all these sorts of things. And there's sort of long range airstrikes represented by playing cards. I think it's a fairish overview of a certain amount of it.
Yep.
Uh, and you're on the pointy end of the design at this point, I think. And
Yes.
we ran up to a few things during the play test which you're not. I think you were saying you weren't super happy with, but you're coming to a place where you're at least figured out what it is that is making you unhappy about them.
Well, so here we are. Here we are, past the deadline of handing the manuscript in,
This is
and
where Mike lives.
that this is where I live. And I am supposed to be making the final edits to the rules that have been out through public beta for a while. But the problem is that it's not had as much playtesting as any of my other games so far. The beta test has been, the people who've picked it up and have played it has been extraordinarily valuable to me, but I have not had the density of feedback that I've had on the other games. And because it's a game with lots of fog of war, it's been quite difficult to play by myself to the degree that I would normally play test things by myself. And even when I do play things by myself, it sort of doesn't capture what is going on with the game. So that's all sort of to say I'm much less confident about this design than I have been at similar points on my other games. But there have been points on my other games where I have looked at the horror that I have wrought and been like, no, there's something stinking in the middle of this that isn't working, that's making it not fun. And quite often that's about going back to, and that is something that's just experienced viscerally. And I think during the games, I was sort of, because I'd been editing the text for a while, and not really playing the game for a while, a lot of the rules weren't like solidified in my mind. And so I had to sort of encounter it, perhaps not as a new player, but at least as an unfamiliar player, because I couldn't remember which bit of the rules revision we were on and all that good stuff. And so I guess what I found was something that had a lot of clunkiness in the places that I wasn't wanting clunkiness. And I didn't enjoy the sort of texture of the game in the way that I wanted it to come across. And so at this point, it reminded me of a similar point in A Billion Suns where I essentially despised the game that I had written, but I knew that there were lots of good things in there. It's just that they weren't coming together in the way that I wanted to. And so trying to debug what's going on with Pacific Command has been the work of the last couple of days. And I guess to a degree, it's about going back. I have gone back to my design principles and I've thought about what it was that I was excited about at the beginning of this game, or as actually is the case with both A Billion Suns and this game, what I came to realize I was excited about 30% into the design. And so the thing that I'm excited about is that, I wrote this game called Pacific Command, and it started off as sort of a drift on A Billion Suns because A Billion Suns has a lot of like appearing units, and I thought that that might be the way that you would do um, uh, squadrons of attack fighters and bombers and stuff like. But what it turned out to be is the more I studied the period and the more that I listened to people telling stories and the more I read the stories, what I realized was that this is a period about a couple of things. One is it's about the uncertainty of locations of units, and the other is that it's about maps because you can't tell the scale of these conflicts except on a map because, essentially because these machines of war, these task forces filled with aircraft carriers and battleships, are engaging each other at ranges of like 300 to 400 nautical miles. Like that's the shooting range in this game. And so when you have a game with shooting ranges that are 300 to 400 nautical miles, you end up zooming out to a point where it looks like a map. And the thing that I was really excited about was these decisions, these uncertainties that you have to make, that one hears about admirals making about staging aircraft and how it's a big operation to get all the planes up out of the belly of a carrier, get them ready, and get them launched. And if they're all waiting on the flat top, and they're all bombers and they're about to go and attack someone, and you realize actually your recon has failed and you don't know where they are, and actually there's somebody incoming and you need a combat air patrol to defend the fleet, otherwise you're absolutely going to be destroyed. Then that's an exciting, intense kind of decision that you had to make. And then, so this gets referred to as Nagumo's dilemma. And I wanted to have a reflection of that somewhere in the game. I needed to have something which said, like, something that said there is inertia in my decision making about aircraft. And long story short, like I've come in the beta to this thing where you've got a hand of cards, and the cards represent the ships, the squadrons that you've staged. And there's quite a lot of cards, and it's quite messy, and particularly the physical playing area is quite messy because you need these task force sheets which are large enough to manage playing cards. And because what's interesting is having things of resources available to you, resources committed and resource consumed, that gives you 3 places, and that's a lot of table space. And one of the things that I came across as I was rereading the rule book was a note about how the game, although it advises you to start small, it does function at scales which are accurate representations of the number of vessels and aircraft that were involved in these monstrously large conflicts, like Midway and like the Battle of the Philippines. And the thing is, it just ain't true. It's not currently true with the design. That game will struggle to get anywhere near that scope of battle because it will just crumble over under its own complexity. And I realized that there were 2 pieces of complexity that were really holding it back. One was the complexity that I had put into the narrative scenarios, because I'd been trying to put all these narrative storytelling elements in to make sure that I captured all the little details. And the other is these aircraft cards, these hand of cards. And so I've got a new idea for the way that aircraft will be managed, which I'd like to have a chat with you about, Glenn. And that's sort of more of a sort of design workshopy thing, because I've play tested it for the last couple of days, and it feels better, and it's unlocked a couple of other opportunities. But I think the other thing is, just to add as a note, like, I think partly what's happening here is I've been sitting on this design for a while, and I have been somewhat tentative about it for a few reasons, but one of the main ones has been I haven't felt confident about the material because I'm not coming from, a decade or 2 decades of like interested study in this theater. I'm coming at this relatively new from the last couple of years of like book study. And so I think I kind of crossed a Rubicon recently where coming back to some of this material, I was like, oh yeah, I have actually internalized a lot of this stuff. I do know this period quite well now, and I've got quite good instincts, and I've learned, I've made notes in lots of different areas. I'm feeling quite confident about it, to the point where if I now dial detail back out, I feel that I can defend that because I understand what the abstraction is supposed to do, rather than feeling that I can't really abstract a subject because I don't understand it, and I might abstract it into a way that just feels weirdly unrealistic.
Yeah, I wonder a little bit, and this is you can answer this, is that because I keep saying I think that Pacific Command is much closer to a board game in
Mm,
ways than a minis game. And one of the things I think that you have when you're doing a minis game is that you can go, well, this must be cool because look at this cool mini that you'll get to play with, which is attached to it. And with
mm,
Gaslands, obviously been able to go, Hot Wheels cars, how cool they are, and etc. Where you grab some Hot Wheels cars, zoom, zoom, zoom. With Hobgoblin, it's like, oh, you've got like fancy minis, right? You've got whole armies of them. You never get to use them. Whoa, that's really cool. And in many ways, like Pacific Command not sort of using these poker chips, it's almost like you don't have a line of defense to say you'll definitely be using cool things on your tabletop. So you will definitely be having a certain sort of fun and engaging with a certain sort of toy that you enjoy engaging with. So there's only so badly I can screw up for you.
yeah.
Whereas to a degree, like, if what you tell people is get a load of poker chips, stack them up, push them around a blank blue sheet with literally no terrain on it, if that game does if that game falls down, people have got nothing. You've given them nothing at that point.
That's fair. That's fair. That is fair.
Which is like, I think potentially that's part of, because we've chatted a
One
few
feels
times.
starkly exposed.
Well, I can totally understand why that feels, because it's funny. Like, I think a lot of people maybe.
Right, and I think that what I'm excited about is that the payoff in the other direction is like probably the most powerful piece of alchemy I'll have ever committed, which is I take playing cards and poker chips, and you see like the incredible sweeping scope of these conflicts unfolding in front of you. And if I can get that,
Yeah.
which has happened a couple of
If
times, then that's like, that's a hell of a payoff. But you're
yeah,
right, it removes a safety blanket.
yeah, if juggling flaming chainsaws comes off, it's an incredible show. If it doesn't come off,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
then you've got a chainsaw stuck in your head. And I think, no, I think in all, like, seriousness, like, I think a lot of people watching this channel will be like, well, this is Mike Hutchinson. He's got Gasland, which is a huge hit, A Billion Suns, which is this sort of an indie darling, and a properly published game, and a Hobgoblin that's done really, really well on like Kickstarter. you know he can't seriously be like entering into periods of doubt over a much more, in theory, sort of middle of the road game than like some of the other ones have been.
Yeah.
But of course, you decided to go. Yeah, I shouldn't be nervous about this. This should be the easiest thing in the world. Push around some ships, give people an armor penetration chart. But of course, you've decided to go. But first of all, I'm going to soak myself in petrol and chuck a match in the air. Then let's
What? Yeah. Quite.
let's see how that goes. Um, yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's also been interesting. Like, sometimes, I said to you the other day, sometimes you say you don't feel like you design board games and you're not sort of driven towards
Mm.
board games things. And I keep looking at Pacific Commander going, you absolutely are. You are so, like, I mean, because particularly one of the things about Pacific Command, I think, that makes me feel super board gamey about it sometimes
Mm.
is, oddly enough, the total lack of terrain.
Yeah.
Because, like, if you were pushing poker chips around like a city with buildings and streets and street furniture or whatever to represent a like fog of war thing, like, if it were hidden units going through and you don't know where the infiltrators are or whatever, it would totally feel like, yeah, this obviously has to be a minis game because of the infinite variety of terrain and such like. But the fact that in the Pacific Command as well, that the train is like a blue sheet with some printed out islands really, really, makes me feel again and again and again. This feels so like a board game, but it
I
is.
know, but that's partly a hallucination though, because like we play Man of War, and it is exactly that. We just happen to play it with three-dimensional islands and three-dimensional miniatures, but they function identically.
But I mean, but that's the thing. I think Man of War is such like because it was a boxed game, wasn't it?
Hmm.
You got a box with a whole bunch of chits and special cards and special
That's
measuring
true.
things, all
Yeah.
these sorts of elements. And it's like that. I really do think because sometimes we say board game. Well, sometimes I say board game where I what I really mean is boxed game,
Boxed
as in
game, right.
a thing where the components are so integral to the play experience and so like not super
Yeah, no, actually that's
yeah.
guilty as charged on that one, because essentially what I'm creating for you is a fairly fixed set of components that you're then invited to create in order to participate in, rather than what would normally be the case, which is like here's a way of creating all kinds of here's a way of incorporating all kinds of different objects.
Yeah, because I think with the aircraft staging issue, and hopefully we'll talk about this new
Yeah, I'll
solution.
get into the nuts and bolts of that in a minute.
Like as we were going through it, and I think this is possibly like a learning point for many people is as we were playing it, and the times we played it before, it feels like such a user interface issue, and it's like playing it. I can totally see how, as a designer, like you're just thinking, well, you've got a hand, you've got some cards. You move like 3 or 4 cards from here to just over there to just over there, and back to your hand. This is fine. This is just moving like 2 or 3 cards across some clearly delineated pieces, and then you put like 3 different like bits of paper onto the tabletop, each of which have got 3 stacks of like 3 or 4 cards,
Yeah.
and some of those cards you've got to, and it's like like in theory, it's a very clean thing, a very simple set of moves, that should be very clear and very easy to engage with. In practice, the user interface, like of physically doing that with these cards that are a little too big sometimes, and because they're normal playing cards, they're not sort of instantly recognizable as being bombers and whatnot, and you've got them face
Mhm.
up at some points and face down at others, and they slide about a little bit when you like go to grab one of them and put them in another place, and you put them like here temporarily because they're not staged, but you want to remember that they're part of the bombing run, and these ones you're, and it's just like it's the user interface that absolutely was killing that for me. And it's one of those
Yeah.
things that if you were making a boxed game would be an absolute
Well, you just
non-brainer.
have a ton more tools available to you. You have
Yeah,
loads more options.
the cards would be little mini cards, so they'd be like that much easier to move around. You could have like recessed sections within the shipboard, so you could actually slot the cards into them so they wouldn't slide around all over the place. You could
Yeah.
have like far more notation and writing, and and this is one of the things I've spoken about before. We've talked about when a game should be a minis game and when it should be a board game and what the lines are. Is that these user interface questions are not non-questions, and they're not nothing to do with design questions, and like really digging in and considering them and what they mean can really change a design, I think, and really shape it and be important to make it work.
Yeah,
uh,
and so I think that clumsiness in the user interface um was the entry point to the last sort of design sprint that I had here, which was basically to say, all right, bold question, what if we dump this whole subsystem? Like it's a very integral subsystem, like the stacks of chips being a fog of war is the first important one, the hands of cards being the squadrons that you stage and manipulate being the second. So what happens if we dump it? What do we replace it with? Um, and where my head went as I was sort of trying to figure out, okay, well, I have I have here a system which is slightly too granular. It has too many moving pieces. It has too many components. So clearly, I have not abstracted it enough. And I think partly that's because I wanted to be sure that the difference between different kinds of aircraft mattered or didn't matter. And so I wasn't yet confident whether the difference between torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and level bombers was an important part of the strategic viewpoint, because it often gets mentioned during the stories. And remember, I'm trying to basically create a story engine for the sorts of stories that are told about the Pacific theater in World War II. Um, So what I did was I said, well, let's sweep some of that detail aside and let's just say, look, the important thing is that within a round, which represents sort of an afternoon or most of the day of combat, I really only get a couple of chances to stage aircraft. In reality, like I've got only a certain amount of time to land, to lift the ships, to fuel them, to get them to take off, to land other ones, so on and so forth. So I thought, well, let's make an arbitrary decision for having essentially having one decision at the beginning of the turn, which is the sort of logistics decision, which is, am I going to pick one of three stances, broadly speaking, which is, am I going to go full aggressive, which is I'm gonna stage up two bombing kind of air groups. Am I going to go balanced with one bombing and one combat air patrol defensive, or am I going to go full defensive and I've got both air groups that I've staged are combat air patrol? And so if I'm going defensive, I lose all ability to strike, but I've got two really solid shields for when you come at me. If I go full aggressive, I've got a couple of really strong, essentially weapon shots out of my unit, but I'm left sort of naked, and I need to make sure that that's a bold move that I have to be sure that I'm not going to be that you don't know where I am, or you haven't got the arms to bear against me. And so that means that each task force at the beginning of the round just has to make a decision about two cards, rather than what was essentially kind of 13 to it was like 9 to 15 cards were being manipulated rather than just two. um, and it has a couple of knock-on effects, but broadly speaking it means that the attack strength of my air group and the defensive strength of my air group becomes simply a number that I have purchased during fleet building. Like I have filled up my carriers with certain balance of the two types of ship, and that gives me a balance of the two types of statistics. Basically a sort of strike value or a cap value. So it becomes much simpler at the point of resolving an airstrike, because there isn't a set of card manipulation. There is simply a set of, like, well, you've got a bunch of dice essentially coming in, and can you ping those dice off first with interceptors, and then can you ping some more of those dice off with anti-aircraft, and then we roll the attacks at the end.
Yeah, because I think it was because I do think it's one of those points where it is granularity super rewarding for a given design. Because like, so before you had like a ship would have sorry, a fleet would have like whatever, four fighters and three torpedo bombers and three dive bombers, and then you've got to pick five of them to be your bombing run. And there were a few times where I was sort of sitting there with a hand of cards, just being like, I kind of want to blow something up, and I kind of want to have a bit of defensive options. So I don't know, two
Yeah,
fighters,
and
three
to a degree,
torpedoes.
the difference was sort of interesting when there was an air base, because like level bombers are slightly better against that, and torpedo bombers are slightly worse against it. But it's you know a lot is made of it in the history books, but it is essentially a fractional difference in performance. And the other thing is that a lot of the decision about, is it bomber type A or bomber type B, is really just down to, like, well, what had they been building in their factories? Like, what did they have available to them? It's not necessarily a super interesting question where you have lots of resources available and you could make an optimal answer. It's more just like I'm kind of stuck with what I've got, so let's go.
Yeah, and I found as a player there are times where it's like, okay, I can either have two fighters and three bombers, or three fighters and two bombers. That's like it essentially ended up being like the difference of one dice in one bit of a phase, or one die, or the same dice in another bit of the phase, and it's like it's such a minor difference, and it's a dice anyway, and it needs a five or more to hit. So it's like I don't even know if this is a choice that is
Yeah, and so it's a
doesn't
choice
matter.
that existed, but that's all it did. It just existed. It didn't have anything interesting about it. Like, it didn't matter if you made the decision either way, really.
Yeah, it was the sort of thing that felt like it was the sort of thing you should think about, but that you probably shouldn't. That it probably.
Right. Where so this new system is a much more bold strike of, like, well, what stance am I going to take? Like, how much do I care about, essentially the basic mechanics here of whether I should be, stabbing forward and leaving myself open for a counterattack or not.
I mean, what I think is for me, like watching it sort of come together, I find super interesting about Pacific Command is how abstracted so many of the parts are of it are at this point, because it's
Mm,
like the the aircraft strikes were like, that okay, you're staging the various so there's okay, so there's sort of three to my mind, right, four main parts of the game. There's like the fog of war element, that the fleet's represented by these poker chips, and you can never be quite sure where the actual ships are and which are just whatever radar ghosts.
mm,
The staging and the striking at incredibly long ranges, like, relatively speaking, of ships. The actual close-up battles that occasionally happen when like two fleets sort of hit into each other, and the overall sort of strategic thing of the actual scenarios and the movements and the story being told there. And
mm,
the so the other day when we were playing, we had a thing where because if a fleet isn't revealed and we don't know where the fleet is, you can't just send a bombing run at what might be an empty patch of sea. You had to sort of recon it, and then you can send a bombing run in. And
mm,
because there's also a thing where you can sort of um, rehide a fleet by bumping it into another stack of chips, or by splitting it out in this sort of shell game thing. What the result there was that, splitting the stacks made you invincible. So someone reconned you, and then you went invincible. And someone reconned you, and someone went invincible. And it sort of just ended up being, I'm going to do a thing, I'm going to undo the thing, I'm going to do the thing, I'm going to undo the thing, which is always
yeah.
awful. And so that, that's had to sort of be sort of shifted around a little and abstracted a little, and moved about. And there's a point where it's staging the planes on the ship and then sending the planes over to the other ships to bomb them, and that's been a little bit more abstracted out. And the ship to ship battles, I think, where they actually encounter each other versus what many people would expect to see when that happens in a naval fleet game, is very abstracted out. And because the scenarios themselves are over these sort of what are massive areas, the scenarios are quite abstracted out, where it's like, go take that, airfield. Well, how do you take that airfield? Roll a handful of dice, and then
Mm,
it's taken or it's not. And to me, it's, yeah, I find it very interesting quite how many of the things that you would traditionally default to thinking are important in a game like this have come to fall away as you've been trying to get to the core of what is actually interesting you in it.
that's
And
right.
it's and what I mean, I like it. It's my kind of thing because as I've spoken before on the channel, I don't I'm interested in the sort of the thing between two people. I'm not super interested in, like, oddly maybe for me, crunchiness on the tabletop. I want to, as quickly as possible, be able to get to the other person and interact with the other person. And Pacific Command is like been all about trying to get to that thing of bluffing, figuring out which stack is which, those sorts of things. Like when we played the other day, Mike, you mentioned that like some people.
Well, yeah. So I had set it out for beta, and a couple people had come back. I think it might have been Jimmy from Torch and Shield, had came back and said they obviously didn't have as good short-term memory as us, and so they had just constantly lost their task forces in these unnamed, indistinguishable piles of poker chips all over the table. And so they were just constantly checking the chips to see where the task force were, and it became really obvious which one had the task force in because it would get thumbed through the whole time. And so he said he was starting to like draw pencil sketches on the top to like remember which one was which. And I thought, oh, actually, there's an easy way of doing this. If you slip a bit of paper next to it or on top of it or between the chips that says a code name. So I was looking at Goose, and I knew that Goose, was mostly just a couple of blank chips and a gambit. But over there, Horse actually had two of my thingies in.
Yes, and the what I codenamed my stack of 5 chips were Task Force 1, Task Force 2, Task Force 3, stack of gambits, and other gambits. And I put those out, and Mike looked at me and went, "You sadistic bastard." And it's like, that to me is.
Because it perfectly illustrated it, because and he was like, are there any rules about this, and can I swap them round? But it perfectly illustrated that like it's ultimately a mind game and there aren't any rules in those sort of mind games.
And it's like, you more and more what I think of Pacific Command is Mike Hutchinson's social deduction game. Which
It's
is
probably the closest I'll get to one. Yeah, fair enough.
it's as close as you can get to like a social deduction game that is which is a historical naval fleet minis game, because
Right, with a tape measure. It's a social deduction
yeah.
game with a tape measure.
Yeah, social deduction game with actual tape measures and actual spending resources and moving things around. It's a very like, once or twice I've sat down to try and write a social deduction game, and I can't because I want to make it like deduction, not social.
Yeah.
We've played social deduction games with people before who have just been like, but there's nothing to go on here. It's just my opinion about whether or not that person's lying. And the people who love social deduction games, like, yes, absolutely, that's the point. But like, for a designer like me, it's like, no, you've got to give people something to actually go on and lay in little things so they can actually figure it out logically, which is like not the way to write those games. And it's so like, Pacific Command is like, it's a social deduction game, but there's lots and lots of information to help you figure out what it might be,
Mm.
real things about, because bluffing is so hard to do in games, because you've got to like give people the tools to bluff, and let the other person know that they're bluffing, or that they should pay attention to this thing that they're doing because it might be a bluff. Because a lot of the time you bluff in a game, the other person has no idea that they're meant to be judging whether it's a bluff or not, and it's just a total waste of resources.
Yeah.
Yes. So Pacific Command is Mike's. I think it's your most avant-garde, most out there thing that you've done to
Yeah,
this
it's pretty
point.
wacky.
And
It's
I
pretty wacky.
totally.
But like, so where I'm at with this two card system now, I feel like it's real fast to sort of to lay out, because you only lay these cards on task forces, you don't lay them on stacks. So you've only got to make a couple of decisions. Like in the starter fleets, you've only really got two task force that have got aircraft, and so you only have to decide for those guys. So you've only got to make two quick decisions, and then when it's your turn, you get to spend a command chip, which is basically like an activation token, and you can take an air action. So I've combined the air actions back together again where they were 3-4 months ago. And so you do the recon, and if you have got if you've successfully revealed a task force in the stack, and you've got a like a bomber squadron as the card that you've brought from your two cards, and you've placed one, you've sort of set it as the thing. If the recon fails, you can sort of discard that set card in order to re-roll the recon, but that means that you've discarded your bombers, so sucks to be you. Or if there is a reveal task force because you've either reconned it or it was already there, and you've got a black bomber squadron as the card that you've set, then you're off to the races, and you can sort of carry on with the strike. And that's when they would need to reveal if they've actually got a red card hidden next to their task force, and they can reveal that to summon intercept dice to shoot down your incoming strike dice. And so that also means that the sort of air action thing is much simpler, because what was an additional clunkiness about this squadron hand of squadron cards is that I had a hand of squadron cards, but they weren't what was used to adjudicate success. They translated into dice, and that was annoying and arbitrary and annoying, and so and should have just been the card values, but that way led madness. So I'd never even attempted that. So in this way, it's fine, because you just reveal a card and you'd be like, okay, cool, this card's going to get like 12 dice stacked on it. And we know that the number is 12 because my task force has a strike value of 12. And so the only piece that I'm really, oh yeah, and the other thing is that as I was working through that, I realized that there was an additional piece of craft that had stayed in the design, which I managed to optimize out, which is um, the previous beta rules. When you shoot your ship guns at another task force, or you shoot your torpedoes from your torpedo bombers, then you roll to see if you hit, and then if you do hit, you roll a further dice to see what you hit. And essentially, it was like it meant it was a way of ensuring that like ships like destroyers got hit first and your high value stuff got destroyed second. But as I was going through this, I realized that I'd invented a completely unnecessary additional step, and that if I made this purely about the human decision making and removed what is essentially just a table that's sitting in the very end of this resolution system, which is just ghastly and horrible. And why is there a table here? Good God, man. Um, so instead of having a table of like destroyers, cruisers, carriers, battleships, it simply says basically the Gasland system, which is a 4 or a 5 is a hit, and a 6 is a special hit. And so a 4 or a 5, it hits the fleet, but you, the person who's getting struck, gets to decide what they hit. And so you obviously put them on your totally crud destroyers, which is the point. That's your ablative hit points. And so it instantly turns destroyers into a sort of hit point system. And then if I roll a 6, then that's a precise hit, and I can place that on your high value targets. But high value targets like need a couple of 6s. So you need 2 6s to knock out a fleet carrier and 3 6s to knock out a battleship. So I have to roll really hot or have a lot of dice to be able to like actually get the. And so that allowed me to remove hit points, which is another like piece of garbage that, because I wanted to reflect how ships are, there's like a store that, I mean, there's literally like a number of bombs that it takes to destroy a carrier. And a lot of the stories that are told, like, it tends to not be the first or even the second. It's like the third bomb that sorts the carrier out. And so I wanted to reflect that. But what I had done was done it with hit points, which is a very normal and natural way of doing it. But I had created there um, uh, what is essentially a UI problem, which is I created a piece of administration for you that you had to record the damage. And some people were saying like, oh, but this is annoying because any ship that's got multiple hit points should be broken out on a different row of the sort of task fleet, because this is confusing to. And all of these signals were just pointing at the fact that there was a mechanic that was too detailed that didn't need to be there, but I couldn't see the way to get rid of it. And so I'd been orbiting around this, like, well, maybe you roll dice and you spend successes to achieve things. And so it's all just like, to a degree, it feels like very small optimization iterations, but that are all orbiting around a similar sort of sets of solutions. It's just that because it's such fine clockwork to get something like this working, you think that it's almost right, and yet that thing itself can explode on the table as, explosive garbage. But that doesn't mean that it's all wrong. It just means that like there's quite a tightly sprung machine that's not quite right. It's not totally wrong. It's just not quite right.
No, I know. Yeah, and I think what's interesting there is that you've gone a route which is players get to choose a thing, which is like how I think you should, if given the option, let the players choose the thing.
Exactly.
Is that
Exactly. Why a table?
always results in to my mind, a more interesting result.
Right, like people who roll, people who do wipeouts and say, no, well, this should be a scatter dice. It should be a scatter dice in Gaslands for wipeouts. It should be a random decision. It's like, well, yes, sure, I could have put a scatter dice in. It's another component. It's another annoying thing that's like visible in different directions from different perspectives. And also, it's just more fun to have another player make a decision.
Because this is the thing, and this is what I'm sort of getting at here, is the choice between the sort of, and something we spoke about like a little while ago on the channel, is the choice between the sort of the emulationist Gamic option or the simulationist option. And the simulation in Gaslands is that a wipeout is random and you could be pointing in any given direction. And the simulationist option is that sometimes you're pointing in a boring direction, in a
Yeah.
direction it's just utterly uninteresting. You basically just, it doesn't do anything, you're just pointing where you're pointing. And the Gamic solution is give it to another player, and then you will always be pointing in the direction that is the funniest, the most annoying, the most weird, the most interesting, which is not realistic and not
Mm,
accurate to a simulation of reality, but that's the Gamic choice. And
mm,
here I imagine there'd be people who'd say it's like, Okay, well, whenever a fleet gets bombed, it's always the destroyers and the aircraft carriers like get hit first by the fours and fives or the sixes, and then you essentially move inwards to like the middle of the fleet, which is the last things to get wiped out. Which is it should be dotted around. It should be like occasionally these guys in the middle get hit, and the answer is, to my mind, but the guys in the middle getting hit is the most boring thing to happen. They're the guys that they're not like they're not what either player wants to have happen, and this is a way of sort of a cutting out some mechanics and b going like somebody is going to care every time a bomb lands. Either the attacker is going to be it's another of the destroyers gone down, or the defender is going to be like, oh no, you've got my battleship, sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's also, I think it's going to create a feeling in the game where, like, people are going to say about Pacific Command, it benefits people who can pop a lot of sixes. Like
Mm.
it just does. This game benefits, like, it has a dice pool system where you tend to roll, like, more than a dozen dice in each sort of throw, and you're quite often looking for, fives and maybe just sometimes just sixes. But having said that, like, rolling a fistful of dice and hunting out for sixes, and the fact that it's 1 6 or 2 6 really mattering, like the difference between like a game changing sort of damaging hit on the fleet carrier, like, that's a vibe. Like, it won't be for everyone, but that is a vibe.
Well, I think what is ironic is that the people who will, I suspect, most dislike Pacific Command will be some of the older sort of grognardy naval fleet gamers. And the reason I think it's ironic is that a lot of the oldest naval fleet games have like these very complex armor penetration charts that go through stage after stage after stage after stage. And what they ultimately boil down to is tipping absolute buckets of dice out and then thinning them down and thinning them down and nothing happening turn after turn until like something that requires you to roll like nine sixes in a row happens, and you hit the like ammo store or whatever, and the entire ship goes up in a because that's the sort of thing that happened.
Yeah.
And in many ways, those old games are all about popping sixes. It's just that there's so many
Right.
dice
No,
that
yeah, yeah.
it doesn't feel that way. It's about the attrition of probability finally pooping out. And so, in
Yeah.
many ways, ironically, I think that it popping sixes is the most traditional, old school naval fleet thing about it. But it is the thing that will be thrown at it as one of its major.
Potentially, yeah. What I feel about it. The other thing that this has an impact on, this change, is that because of the two changes of, essentially, you now shoot a weapon that's called your airstrike, and you defend with a sort of shield that is called your combat air patrol. Like, and the fact that now the damage, the location table is basically just a decision between the two players, and so, as you say, like, destroyers matter and fleet carriers matter. It makes list building much clearer and more intention. Like, it's easier to list build with intention in Pacific Command this weekend than it was last weekend, because essentially you can say, essentially your decision is, for aircraft, it's like, how much aircraft capacity can I afford in the form of carriers? And then how do I choose to balance that capacity across attack and defense? And then, to a lesser degree, how much am I going to avoid? I could maximize my aircraft, but that would cost me points. And so, do I go for sort of 60% capacity of my aircraft because actually I'd like to be able to fill it up with other ships? Um, and then the other part of the decision is like, the more destroyers I buy, the more cheap wounds I have as ablative armor for the thing. But like, the worse deal I'm getting on guns dice and other like defensive mechanisms. So how much am I going to lean into slightly more expensive, slightly more it's basically a high risk strategy that, like, if you put a couple of battleships in, they are going to be they are going to need ablative armor, because I said you have to pop a couple of sixes to sink, three sixes actually, to sink a battleship. I don't have to pop any sixes if the only ship you've got to choose to assign damage to is your battleship. Oh, and that's the other thing. Because of this, a single hit kills anything, unless it's these, like, the other person precise hitting it. Anyway, there's a slight complication there. But anyway, the point being that it makes list building much more of a clear tension between picking picking worse armor or worse, like cheaper hit points, or better, more powerful concentrations of points.
Okay, I think that's been a decent chunk of conversation there. I don't know how valuable it's been to any, because it's kind of us talking about a thing you're working on. But hopefully there's been some things there that we talked about that might be helpful to somebody working on their own design. I'd say if you are like a fan of naval fleet games, or if you are a fan of social deduction games, or if you are curious as to what the heck
Or if
might
you're a fan of mad miniature games that haven't been attempted before.
the maverick designer that is Mike Hutchinson is up to now. Please do swing that down into the comments section. Let us know what about the many things we just waffled on about might
Catches
interest.
your interest, yeah.
Whether you think that sort of taking some of the categories and some of the ideas of what are more traditionally board games and card games and working them into the miniatures gaming sphere are a good idea or a bad idea, which things you would like to see worked in the future. Let us know about that in the comments section. While you're down there, punch the like and subscribe buttons and follow the link that's there over into our Discord, and also tell us those things within our Discord server, where lots of people who I'm sure will tell me those things anyway.
Yeah, and in particular, join. I love being joined in my suffering. If you have experienced that point in a game where you realize that you hate it and you want to blow it up and destroy it, like I love, those are some of the most illuminating parts of any design process. So yeah, come tell us about those.
And also, since Mike is feeling like he hates his game and wants to blow it up and everything around it, follow the link to the Patreon in our links and give him money to make him feel better about the fact that he wants to destroy the game that he's working on.
That is not the correct branding for how I offer my Patreon.
As long as
If you
they...
wish to continue to see me developing mad miniature games that have never yet been attempted whilst stunt riding over 6 elephants, then you can come and help me out by
Which,
subscribing to my Patreon,
whichever way you want,
fueling me with caffeine for the venture.
whether it's support to continue or pity money for your pain, so long as they swing by and join the Patreon, it's all good.
It's all the currency, yeah.
But for now, from this episode of Rule of Carnage, I think that's going to be a thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye. Bye 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 bye.